though it is August, I know that I'm really happy to have the chance to engage with the new scholarship that we're going to hear about today. Before we move into to the two speakers, I want to make a few service announcements. First of all, I want to thank the Jordan Center once again for facilitating all this. Thanks Sasha Spalnik for doing all she does to make this possible. Thank the Jordan Center for supporting a web presence for us. It's been incredibly not just helpful but necessary to what we've been able to do so far in 19V. If you haven't yet checked out our 19V landing page, please do. Maybe Sasha can put it in the chat for us. It essentially links to all the other to the various initiatives that people have undertaken. And one thing that I hope is clear from the website is that, you are free to start more initiatives. And we have a new one coming up about early Turgenev. It's really kind of a coordinating point for things that people want to do overall. Let me just announce the two seminar series talks we have coming up in September. First is Wednesday, September 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that's earlier than usual. And the reason it's earlier than usual is that Maria Tarutina is joining us from Singapore. She's at Yale University, Singapore, and her topic will be Exoticism Abroad, Vasily Pilyonov and Ilya Repin's visual experimentations with ethnic and racial differences in Paris. And the собеседник for that will be Nathaniel Knight from Seton Hall University. So that's really exciting. And then Wednesday, September 2nd at noon Eastern Standard Time, Shama Shahadat, I see Shama here, hello, is going to, from Tübingen University, is going to speak on the difficulty of ending a story, on the thick novels of Russian realism, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And we'll have a собеседник to announce for that too. So those are our upcoming events. Very much looking forward to today. I'm going to hand it over to Sasha for some technical announcements before we get going. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne. And welcome everyone to the Virtual Jordan Center. Welcome back for all of those who've joined us for previous 19V events. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. I'm going to mute everyone now. And if you could please keep yourselves muted for the duration of the lecture, that would be much appreciated. If you could please also open your chat windows and your participants windows and update your name to your full name, that would be great. And that is just to facilitate our Q&A, which will happen after the lecture. I'm going to partially disable chat for the duration of the lecture portion of today's event. So if you're experiencing any technical difficulties or anything like that, chat with hosts will be turned on. So you can send me a message, and if need be, I'll stop the presentation, we'll fix the problem and get back to it. Once we begin the Q&A, I will enable chat with everyone, and you can send your questions. You can write out your questions and send them into the chat, and I will read them aloud, or you can send me a message saying that you'd like to speak, and I will add you to the queue, and I will call on people in the order that we receive your request to speak. And I believe that is all that I have. So take it away. You're muted, Anne.
I'm now unmuted so I can introduce today's topic and speakers. The topic is new research in the 19th century Russian Gothic. And our speakers are Valery Sobel from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Catherine Bowers from University of British Columbia. And they both have new books or about to be books on the Gothic. Valery Sobel's book is called Haunted Empire, Gothic and the Russian Imperial Uncanny. It's coming out or has just come out from Cornell. And Catherine Bowers' book, expected soon from University of Toronto Press, is called Writing Fear, Russian Realism and the Gothic. And I know I'm extremely interested to hear this talk because both of these projects point to the fact that we have underappreciated the role of the Gothic in shaping Russian literary development, especially in the 19th century. So I think that this work is really important and potentially transformative for our understanding of how 19th century Russian literature actually works. And it's a really vibrant new area of research. We're lucky to have this sort of double team way of approaching it today with Valeria and Catherine. And I think that Valeria is going to start out and then hand it over to Catherine, and they'll be going back and forth. And when they're done, we'll open the floor to questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for introducing us. And of course, huge thanks to the organizers of this lecture series, to the NYU Jordan Center, to Anne, Ilya, Sarah, Sasha, all the participants and the audience, of course. And I think I will probably express the sentiment of many of us. And in fact, some of you have already expressed this sentiment to me in private exchanges. What a welcome escape, intellectual escape, respite this group has been. Some of us, it's been a horrible summer for everybody, but not horrible, but challenging. But for those of us who are in administrative positions, I'm the department head, many of your chairs and deans and so on, that's been just anything but, you know, the opportunity to explore your academic and intellectual interest. It's been constant emails, meetings, face shield orders, human resources, immigration rulings, right? All this bureaucratic administrative stuff. And this, this series provided a really, really much needed outlet for our academic pursuit. So thank you so much. So let's plunge into today's discussion. So before Katya and I introduce and talk about our books in more detail, we'd like to talk more generally about the Gothic as a literary genre and the current state of the field to which our studies are hoping to make a contribution. And I apologize in advance when talking about Gothic literature as a genre. I might be talking about things that may be very obvious to some of us and many of us. But since we have an interdisciplinary audience and the Gothic specifically in a literary context in Russia is not as at least prominent and recognized as say in the British context, I thought it would be helpful to go over a bit of the history of the term and the specifics of the genre. So let me pull up my slide. And I think I know how to do that. Okay, I did teach in the spring through Zoom. Okay. We'll go back to the beginning. Okay. So the term Gothic obviously is related to the Goths, right? The Germanic tribes that sacked Rome. And as most literary terms or aesthetic terms, it had a pejorative connotation in the beginning, like Baroque, like Romanticism, Realism, and so on. So of course, Goths were seen as a barbaric tribes, right? And when the style of architecture emerged, the well-known Gothic architecture in the Middle Ages, later on, Renaissance humanists applied the term Gothic to it with the kind of negative connotations of everything in classical antiquity was not barbaric, ornate, irrational, and so on, right? Whimsical, right? Tasteless, not harmonious, and you name it. And this kind of similar negative aesthetics also defines the literary Gothic genre in the 18th century. And the term negative aesthetics is by Fred Botting, famous scholar of European Gothic. So of course, you know, it appears in the Age of Reason and stands for everything Enlightenment is not. Again, irrational. So it's always defined through some kind of negation, through the absence. Irrational, unscientific, right, superstitious, not related to reason, and so on. But at the same time, precisely because, so it's kind of seen as also medieval, of course, right, which was considered as dark ages in the Enlightenment period. So precisely because of its focus on this irrational sphere, Gothic literature also signaled the crisis of the Enlightenment, revealing the limitations of its epistemological optimism and scientific rationalism. So in the literary context, the connection with Goths was lost, and the term Gothic came to mean simply medieval. And it is in this sense that Horace Walpole uses it in the title of his novel, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story. That's the actual subtitle of his novel, and that's where the genre took its name from. And the novel is set in vaguely sometime between the late 11th and mid 13th century. And the novel was so successful, and then we have this explosion of British Gothic, exemplified here by a few names, with Anne Radcliffe and her portrait representing perhaps the most popular and prominent contribution to the genre. She wrote many extremely influential novels. And the peak really comes in the 1790s and through the 1810s. And scholars later interpreted this fact as a literary response to the political events, the French Revolution, the terror, the disturbing uncertainties of the Napoleonic era. So this connection between this literary mode and some political and cultural anxieties goes back to its very beginning. So these are all very different works, and yet they have traditionally been characterized as Gothic in a particular literary sense that is not reduced to its medieval setting. In fact, it's often not required. So I do have a kind of serious academic list, a laundry list of Gothic features, literary characteristics of the genre. But before I do this, since we're on Zoom and it's boring, let's look at the graphic kind of picture representation of this that Guardian published back in, well, not back, 2014. That's kind of funny, but also very accurate, in fact. So it was called How to Tell Your Reading Gothic Novel. So one of the first characteristics is there's almost always the Gothic villain who's a murderous tyrant with scary eyes, with glistening eyes, right? I've seen so many texts in the Russian canon, not canon, Russian Gothic corpus as well. And this tyrant usually tortures or persecutes a young innocent maiden who's at his power. Either he's an uncle or a legal guardian, and that migrates from the British to Russian and Ukrainian Gothic as well. So the second picture in this graphic representation is precisely this innocent maiden who swoons a lot, and they have a whole scale of swooning. I think Emily from Mysteries of Udolpho leads the way. It was 9, 10, I can see. Okay, the setting is extremely important. One of the key characteristics, of course, is the Gothic castle or some kind of mansion, but also an abbey or a monastery often, setting the secret passages, dungeons, right? So, and I'll talk more about how the setting kind of translates in the Russian context, that Russia didn't have castles, right? Obviously, or not many, but Livonia did, and Ukraine and Western Ukraine did, right? So, okay. There's probably a ghost or a monster. And this probably is important because while we tend to associate the Gothic with the supernatural and the demonic, and it's often true, it's not required. In fact, in Radcliffe's novels, there is never, ever a supernatural, as far as I can tell, supernatural element, but there is a kind of suspenseful buildup to the possibility that there is some ghost somewhere, or there is maybe some creature behind the veil. But in her novels, such suspicions always receive a rational explanation. So that's why not a monster at all in the last column. Lists two of the 4 novels are by Radcliffe. Okay. It's set in the olden days, so the pastness of the Gothic is very important. It started as medieval and then sometimes moves closer to the present moment, and eventually, as they say in the footnote, in more later 19th century Gothic, like Dracula, right? It's more contemporary, but nonetheless, there is this kind of temporal distance, or sometimes the geographical setting plays this role of the temporal distance. You don't need to travel to the past. You can travel to Spain or to Scotland, Highland Scotland, to get back to this, you know, to confront this medieval barbarism and darkness that we don't have anymore. And I'll address it later. We might talk a little bit more. So here's the geography, right? As you can see, Italy heavily predominates with some Spain and southern France usually, and a bit of Germany, but really Catholic countries tend to dominate. Because it's written in Britain, right? In the Protestant country, which tries to kind of get away from its Catholic past. The weather is always awful. Yes, the you know, ominous, you know, darkness, rain, thunder, and so on. But this is more important to my project. Anyone who is into white Protestant is frightening. And again, it takes on a different connotations in the Russian context, right? But this Gothic otherness is important. So scary Catholics, scary rich people, scary poor people, or in Russian Gothic, scary Ukrainians, scary Finns, scary Livonians, or scary, not clear who they are. And that's really the essence of what I'm looking at, the uncanny aspect of the Russian Imperial Gothic, the indefiniteness of the ethnicity that's somewhat different, but not entirely. And now they have a few more, but I included the most important ones. And this is a more academic, proper summary of basically some of the same features. Transgression, violation, but taboo is important for the Gothic genre, especially incest tends to be common. I've talked about the setting already and the supernatural element. And at the end of my list, I quote Katya's upcoming book, about which she'll talk today, and the kind of emotional agenda, if you wish, of Gothic fiction, its effect on the reader, and the particular set of emotions it's supposed to invoke. And very quickly towards the end of this introduction, I'll say a few words about how the Gothic genre migrates into Russia. Of course, here I rely on Vadim Vatsura's seminal work. He talks about various ways in which Gothic fiction sweeps the literary scene in Russia in the early 19th century, really first decades, in the form of numerous translations, usually from French actually, not directly from English, and adaptations, as well as parodies and travesties. And of course, Radcliffe enjoyed the greatest popularity to the extent that when the Russian translation of Lewis's The Monk, Monarch, right, came out in 1802 in Russian, it was attributed to Slavnaya Госпоже Radcliffe, or renowned Mrs. Radcliffe. So Russian publishers clearly didn't know who Lewis was, but Radcliffe sold well. And then we have a marking recipe for a novel a la Radcliffe by Rez Somov as early as 1816. And in my own research, I've encountered the term Radcliffism or Radcliffean at least well into 1840s as a shortcut for Gothic, usually with a condescending or kind of dismissive connotation, like Radcliffean cave. This is a very Radcliffean chapter. So this really persists. So in general, after the 1820s, the Gothic novel, like as represented by the list I had shown before, as a distinct genre wanes, but its elements, or rather what I call the Gothic mode, not just I call it, but I think it's important because we don't really have many like canonical Gothic novels in the works, or in the corpus I look at, for example, or Katya for that matter. But the Gothic mode, the connection of those Gothic tropes, typical recognizable Gothic conventions, and the themes they invoke, right? The transgression, irrationality, past history haunting the present. This complex continues to reemerge throughout the 19th century. And in our book talks, we'll address various aspects of this continuing relevance of the Gothic mode. But first, Katya will talk a bit about Gothic studies as a field. Yeah. Thank you. I'll stop sharing and switch to Katya. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for working on my screen share here. Continue. Yes, good. Okay, slides. So, I wanted to also interrupt and quickly thank the Jordan Center and Anne and Sasha and Sarah and everyone for having us to give our kind of like doppelganger talk on the Gothic. And so where I'm going to start is pretty much where Valeria left off, which is with Anne Radcliffe. Anne Radcliffe is really, I think, kind of the key to how or why Slavist scholars started looking at the Gothic as something interesting. Mysteries of Udolpho was enormously popular and influential when it was published. So I start with Mysteries of Udolpho. What you'll notice, so Valeria mentioned that people begin to talk about Radcliffe as kind of like shorthand for Gothic. But if you begin to read people's memoirs or letters from the early part of the 19th century, reviews, what you get in Publicistica, you get a real sense that Radcliffe is making kind of a major splash in the way that Russians are conceiving of literary culture, if that makes sense. Okay, so this, for example, from 1804, the Englishwoman Radcliffe devoted her pen to the most terrifying fantasies, such as could be contrived not by the heart of a woman, but by the imagination of the most inflamed fanatic. And then talking about the wild horrors of Radcliffe's imagination. Right? Here's another one. This is a memoir from later in the 19th century. It says, the novels are really terrible, but with what trembling I penetrated into dark dungeons following Anne Radcliffe, but I gained little from this course of reading, right? And so this kind of idea that Radcliffe is something that is really exciting, that the Gothic is really exciting, that it's this really kind of like guilty pleasure reading, but that these novels are pretty bad. Like definitely emphasis on guilty pleasure, I think is what has kind of shaped the Russian literary scholar critical response to Gothic overall. Valeria mentioned that Matthew Lewis's The Monk was published under Radcliffe's name. In Russia, a number of novels were published under Radcliffe's name in Russia, many of which were not actually written by Radcliffe. This is an example of one which it's supposed to be by Radcliffe. It's supposed to be translated from the French. Actually, it was probably written by a student at Moscow State University, for whom it was faster to write something pretty trashy and put Radcliffe's name on it and get it published than to actually translate from the French, Radcliffe. And there are a lot of examples of these. This one is available on the Russian State Library website if you want to read some 1811 trashiness. And this is a review of The Monk that was published in the Moskovsky Mercury, 1803. And this is assuming that The Monk was written by Radcliffe, whose name was on the cover, right? The reviewer explains that the novel has a protracted experience of horror that works on the nerves, that it's dangerous for readers to read because they stop sleeping because they're so caught up in what's happening with the Gothic text. And what's really striking about this, and this is where it becomes important for Russian literary studies, is the moment when Gothic enters kind of what we would consider to be, or what would have been considered to be, kind of canonical, like when it merges from something really trashy to something that's maybe more important, and that's when Dostoevsky starts talking about it. So you have these quotes by Dostoevsky, the first from Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, and I should say that Dostoevsky also talks about reading Gothic novels in some of his letters, but these were regularly published. You can see that some of the language that he's using is similar to the language from these. His experience matches the experience of the writers who were writing much earlier. You can see that there's a reference in two Mysteries of Udolpho and the Brothers Karamazov in the court scene, published 1880. So this is something that was definitely in the popular imagination, definitely in Dostoevsky's imagination, and definitely very influential, although by 1863, by 1880, when these things were published, Radcliffe had not been published in Russia in something like 40 years, right? Even fake Radcliffe. So the Gothic enters scholarship, in Russian literary scholarship, through Dostoevsky. The first work that I know of is Leonid Grossman's Kompozitia v Romanie Dostoevskого, 1916, where he begins talking about the way, like kind of lower genres that Dostoevsky was interested in. You have, of course, Robin Foyer Miller's influential study, Dostoevsky and the Idiot, Author, Narrator, and Reader, from 1981, where she identifies a Gothic narrative voice amongst 4 narrative voices in the Idiot. You also have a number of other scholars who are writing about Dostoevsky and Gothic. These include Bakhtin, Mario Praz, George Steiner, Donald Fanger, Joseph Frank, Malcolm Jones, Ignat Absi, Liam Burnett, Randy Gausted, and a lot of other people who will just kind of like mention it. In addition to Gothic scholarship about Dostoevsky, you begin in the 1980s having works that are specifically about what this Gothic movement looked like, right? The first one that I know of is Mark Simpson's very kind of slim volume, The Russian Gothic Novel and Its British Antecedents, 1986. This is pioneering largely because, as far as I know, there was nothing written about the Russian Gothic novel before then as a genre. Eric Naiman's has a chapter about Nep era Gothic in Sex in Public, published 1997. And this chapter, I think, I mention it here, most of the time I'm not talking about book chapters, but this chapter was particularly important. A number of the books that came out talking about the 20th century Gothic were directly inspired by Eric's chapter. Neil Cornwell had a conference and then the edited volume that came from it in 1999, The Gothic Fantastic in 19th Century Russian Literature. You also had some graduate students in the 90s who later published books on this, or who later published chapters on this, working in the UK. One of them, Claire Whitehead, who was working on the Gothic Fantastic. And one of them, Alessandra Tosi, whose book, Waiting for Pushkin, includes a chapter on Nikolai Gnedich's novel from 1803, Don Corrado de Guerrera. But the most important, I would say, work that's been done, certainly the most useful for my research, has been Vadim Vatsuro's 2002 posthumous book, Goticheskiy Roman v России. What Vadim Vatsuro does there is he traces the influence of this kind of imported Western, mostly British, Gothic into Russian literary culture, going through a lot of archival records from the early part of the 19th century. And a lot of the Gothic authors that you might be familiar with or not familiar with appear there. So he'll talk about, for example, the influence of Radcliffe, but then he'll also talk about Radcliffeana. And then he'll talk about the way that Radcliffe began to influence romantic works by people like Lermontov, by Pushkin, et cetera, et cetera. And he does this for a number of other authors. So this is a very useful go-to reference for how that exactly worked in the early part of the 19th century. In the last 2 decades, so since Vatsuro's book came out, there have been a number of books come out that look at Gothic. Most of these are looking at Gothic in the Russian context, but looking at the later Gothic, so 20th century Gothic. These include books by Dina Chapayeva, 2007, 2010, the edited volume by Polyakova and Tamarchenko, which looks at 19th century Gothic, but also some kind of merges into the 20th century, and Miriam Maguire's Stalin's Ghosts and its accompanying volume of translations, Red Spectres, which was published 2012, 2013. If you look at what's happening in Gothic, so if you look at what's happening in Gothic studies in the Russian context, many of these books, what you'll notice is that they're kind of like broad contemporary studies, or they're looking at very specific time periods, or they're looking at very specific authors. But if you look at what's happening in Gothic studies today, like more broadly in the field, what you'll notice is that the field is very vibrant. There are a lot of different topics. So these are just kind of book covers that I pulled up that have come out in 2 different series, one from University of Wales Press, one from Manchester University Press in the last 2 years. And you can see that the topics are really wide ranging. So there are a lot of theoretical approaches that are being used in the Gothic, and a lot of exploration going on in the field about Gothic that is not necessarily the kind of 19th century, 18th century thing that you would think of when you think of the Gothic. So this, yes, Radcliffe is there, but it goes well beyond Radcliffe. Right? Also, in terms of Gothic studies today, I should say that it's very reflective of the kind of anxieties that we have in our current moment. So there's like climate Gothic is a thing. You can see there's a work on eco-Gothic, post-human Gothic, neoliberal Gothic, and there's actually was a call for papers, I think 2 days ago that I saw, which is for pandemic Gothic, which should be coming. It's a conference that will be happening sometime in the spring, if you're a virtual conference, if you're interested. So I think that what this demonstrates is that what we've done in Gothic studies in the Russian context it's just sort of starting now, and it's barely scraped the surface of what's possible. So if we look at the way that Russian and Ukrainian scholars intervene in, or the way that Russian Gothic scholars intervene in the Gothic studies, this is what we have. There are a few edited volumes that will have like one chapter by a Russianist. There have been a couple of articles in Gothic studies which were published by Amir Maguire and Svetlana Kris, but it really, most of the time we are not really represented there. But I should also say that the field tends to be extremely Anglophone world focused. There's a joke that I sometimes make, which is that the so-called International Gothic means a volume with 13 chapters on England and Scotland and like one on France. This is starting to change now with new volumes on, for example, South African Gothic, Spanish Gothic, etc. And so I think that our work on Russian Gothic, Ukrainian Gothic, will really find an interesting audience. Yeah. So most recently, like in the last 2 years, there have been a number of new studies in Russian Ukrainian Gothic. These include 3 key journal clusters or journal special issues. Slavic and Eastern European Journal published Valery Sobol's Forum, Rethinking the Gothic in Ukraine in 2018. This is about the 19th century Ukrainian Gothic. Kevin Platt and Dina Kapayeva edited Russian Gothic, a special issue of Russian literature in 2019. And this is more contemporary, but there's also some coverage of the 19th century kind of Gothic there. And Marina Romanets published or edited a special issue in Canadian Slavonic Papers about post-coloniality and neo-Gothic fictions in the post-Soviet space. And that includes Ukrainian and Russian Gothic works. And that, I think, really the kind of this burgeoning of what's happening, or burgeoning in the field, this is where our books fit in. So Valeria is coming out next month, right? Yeah. And mine coming out 2021. And we are hopefully just kind of the start of what we're hoping will be much more discussion of the Gothic in our field. And with that, I'll hand it back to Valeria.
Thanks so much, Katya. And I'll share screen again. Okay. Have more slides. So first of all, I'll start with shameless advertising campaign or marketing announcement, if I may. The book is, I was hoping I would have it already in my hands. They said they would mail my copies in late August, but I guess this mail is not working very well now, or there's a delay. But the book is officially supposed to come out in mid-September, about a month from now. It's available for pre-order. I do have a 30% discount code. Katya, did you put it on the last slide, or do I need to? Okay.
It'll be on the last slide, yes. Okay,
so it's very simple. 09 flyer, I don't know, Cornell University Press. Okay, and as you can see, the cover image I chose for the book, it happened long before, but quite before the pandemic. I had no idea how evocative it would be. I also had no idea that it will become a pandemic meme, that specific painting by Vereshchagin, but I'm hoping that the meme will pass, you know, the pelmeni and the toilet paper pile and all that. But I think it reflects the kind of mood of my book pretty well. So, so Katya mentioned all those exciting directions in Gothic studies. And one thing that wasn't on the list, because I guess for British Gothic, it's already almost, I don't want to say the passé, the Imperial Gothic, right? It's something that was investigated very actively in the maybe 1990s mostly, but somehow in the Russian context of the Russian Empire, it has hardly been looked at. And but it's not like I decided one day, okay, let's see how this transfers to the Russian case. It was a slow process. The interest of the project grew out of my general, sorry, I need to do actual slideshow, right? I didn't do that. Oops, sorry. Grew out of my you know what, now I have people's windows on the top and I cannot do the slide show. Maybe I can do it other than, okay, sorry. I'm trying, anyway. The project grew out of my interest in empire travel, literature, and geography. It's ethnography, yeah, imaginative geography and ethnography. And the Gothic uncanny element was added later, actually kind of emerged in the process of me working on it, and then became crucial. Unlike Katya's case, which I understand she was an avid reader of Gothic novels before she embarked on her project. But the kernel of my book, of the future book, can be traced to my article on Lermontov's Taman that was published back in in 2011 in Russian Review. And actually I use Taman in the introduction. I don't do a separate chapter in it, but I use this novella as an introduction, as an entryway to the book's argument and problematics and the questions I grapple with in the introduction to Haunted Empire. So give me 1 second. Okay, resume slide. I can do it here. Got it. Okay. So as we remember, and this won't be a repetition of the article because I used it somewhat differently in the book. So I'll just, since I only have limited time to talk about the whole book, I'll talk about Taman a little bit to elucidate my general approach. So as we remember in this novella, Pechorin, the protagonist, right, travels to the Caucasus, and on the way he arrives in the small frontier town of Taman. He tries to find a place to stay late at night and ends up staying in this very suspicious little house. This is a drawing by Lermontov himself. He did stay in Taman in a small house on his way to the Caucasus, and apparently was robbed there. So Pechorin is warned by local Cossack that the place is unclean. And indeed, his very first encounter with the local boy who inhabits the house immediately raises suspicions. So this scene, a lot of us, especially literature people, know this scene very well, but I think it's worth zooming in on it to look at some details. So here's a quote in English and Russian on the slide of this encounter, except that Russian, as you can see, is not entirely Russian, it's heavily mixed with Ukrainian. So, наконец, из синей выполз мальчик лет 14. Где хозяин? Нема. Как? Совсем нету? Совсем. Что без совсем, but anyway. А хозяйка побегла в слободку. Кто же мне отопрет дверь? Сказал я, ударив в нее ногой. Дверь сама отворилась, из хаты повеяло сыростью. Я засветил серную спичку и поднес ее к носу мальчику. Она озарила 2 белых глаза. Он был слепой, совершенно слепой от природы. Он стоял передо мной неподвижно, и я начал рассматривать черты его лица. Then what follows is Pechorin's memorable statement on disability. Okay, yeah, exactly. But he at least is, he confronts his prejudices. And then we learn that the narrator begins to study the boy's face, and what strikes him this like faint smile that runs through the boy's face, and he becomes suspicious whether the boy is really blind. And later, as we might remember, he started questioning whether the deaf woman, old woman who stayed in the house is actually deaf. Then the Russian-Ukrainian exchange resumed. I underlined the Ukrainian portion of it, and he learns more about the inhabitants of the house and their weird non-kinship really connections. So if you break up this episode into its basic components, what you have is a travel to an unknown land gone awry, an overnight stay in a dangerous house, if not a castle, and overall we have this uncertain and suspenseful dark atmosphere. And these are, of course, recognizable tropes of Gothic literature. The motif of sulfur, right here, is this серная спичка, right? Sulfur match. With its demonic connotations further contributes to the eerie effect of this scene. However, what Lermontov describes here is also a colonial encounter. It takes place on the margin of the Russian Empire. It involves the somewhat subhuman local boy who выползает, creeps out of his hut, speaks a different language, has a physical disability easily interpreted by the Russian officer as a kind of moral or emotional deficiency, which interestingly doesn't happen in the case of Dr. Werner later in Princess Mary, who limps, but his limping is described as connecting him to Byron, right? So the boy also serves as an immobile object of Pechorin's prejudiced gaze, стоял неподвижно. So it is this juncture of the literary Gothic tradition and the imperial context in which it is inscribed that constitutes the primary focus of my book. While it may be tempting to interpret Lermontov's use of Gothic tropes as a travesty of the popular genre, indeed the decrepit hata of Taman can be seen as a parody of the traditional Gothic castle, I argue that the Gothic trappings of the novella tap into deeper imperial anxieties. And as I examine other literary works throughout the book, I show that the conventions of the Gothic genre, far from being mere decorations or a tribute to a popular literary form, they in fact channel some of the central ideological, historical, and sometimes philosophical concerns of each particular work. So as readers of Lermontov's novel remember, the mystery of Taman is quickly dispelled by the end of this short section, as the residents of the little house turn out to be mere smugglers, and the narrator luckily escapes them and destroys their nest. This outcome, however, does not cancel the fact that Pechorin nearly met his death here in the small God-forsaken coastal town, самый скверный городишко, right, из всех приморских городов России. It is in this drab place, rather than in the exotic war-ridden Caucasus, that the greatest dangers await the protagonist, despite his official status and the documentation from the capital. He has his подорожная, he has request for казенная квартира, so he's fully armed with this imperial bureaucratic documents, but they prove pretty useless. He can't even leave town, right? Unlike the smugglers who go back and forth freely. So the imperial order disintegrates in this liminal space where the locals' identities and even disabilities are uncertain and evasive, right? The boy speaks fluent Russian, pure Russian, as Pechorin points out later. And the inevitable questions of how Russian this little town of Taman is and how stable the boundaries of the empire are creates an unsettling sense of the unfamiliarity of the location that should be safe, familiar, and domestic. So Pechorin's experience in Taman exemplifies what I call the imperial uncanny throughout the book, drawing on the Freudian concept of unheimlich and its application to colonial and intercultural encounters. And by this term, I refer to disturbing instability in the categories of one's own and the foreign, the familiar and the strange, self and other. At the literary level, this disorienting effect is accomplished precisely by conventional Gothic tropes, which creates that effect of anxiety, disorientation, and that take a new meaning when placed in a specific geographical and historical context. This book thus reads the Gothic as a key literary form that enacts deep historical and cultural tension that arise to a large degree from Russia's idiosyncratic imperial experience. So what's exactly idiosyncratic about it? Recently, there has been a bit of a pushback against this discourse of Russia's exceptionality, the uniqueness of the Russian Empire. And indeed, it shares some fundamental features with other contiguous land empires. And yet, scholars of the empire tend to agree that these features are often particularly prominent in the Russian case, or in any case, whether they're unique or not, they need to be taken into account. And primarily, it's the conflation of the imperial and national identities, its blurred boundaries between the colonizers and the colonized, and the instability of the relationship between center and periphery that Anne so beautifully addresses in her book on the provinces. As a result, such seemingly simple questions, what does it mean to be Russian? Where does Russia proper end and its colonies begin? And what are the origins of the Russian nation and the Russian state? Is it and what now is Ukraine, Finland, Scandinavia, right, Varangians, did not have a straightforward answer. Russia's own cultural dependence on the West problematized the very premises of colonization, as it was never perfectly clear just what superior civilization Russia was supposed to represent. As a result, many Russian imperial subjects, both fictional and historical figures, did not fully feel at home in the massive empire they inhabited and traveled, hence the Unheimlich effect. They were faced with a terrifying void of its vast space and the no less terrifying lack of a meaningful cultural self-identification. So now let me quickly go to the table of contents. So stop share and then share again for the book, just to give you an idea about its structure. Okay, sorry, and share screen again. And here's the PDF, the proof page. So as you see, well, just to give an idea, since not all the authors are mentioned in the titles, so look at a lot of kind of less canonical writers. I do start with Lermontov, but it's a very brief introduction. Then I go through Karamzin, the Decembrist Livonian Tales, the Bestuzhev brothers and Kuchelbecker, The Finland chapter has a lot of material from contemporary 1840s journal, Finski Vjesnik, Kukalnik, Adoevsky, Salamander, and then the short chapter on Ukraine, number 4, focuses on Gogol. Then we have Pogorelsk and Kulish. So the chronological range is 1893 to 1843, really. So it's really the first few decades of the 19th century. And you can see, of course, there's a strong geographical component to the structure of my book. And this attention to the specific imperial context of the later Gothic motifs, including its geography and history, is what I consider as one of my major interventions to the study of this tradition in the Russian context. More often than not, history and geography in Gothic fiction are dismissed by critics as mere props, intended to invoke the largely abstract imagined Middle Ages or just some kind of, again, vague, exotic Southern European locale. I cannot count how many times, I'm sure Katya will confirm, we've seen this in, like, well, this just invokes oceanic landscape, Karamzin, let's move on, and many, many others, right? Because, I mean, in a sense, right, the good guy in the genre world is the historical novel that's supposedly historically specific, ethnographically accurate, and the Gothic is often opposed to it. However, as Robert Migal, a scholar of British Gothic, reminds us, the Gothic is by definition about history and geography, the Goths, right? And I would add ethnography as well. So as I mentioned, the Southern Catholic setting is not just there for pre-romantic exoticism in the British Gothic, right? It's also a time travel of sorts, as I mentioned, into the realm of the medieval darkness and superstition. So in the Russian context too, one of the premises of this book is that it actually matters where, in terms of Russian imperial geography, Gothic encounters take place, what the participants' ethnicities are, and in what historical context Gothic tropes are deployed. In other words, when analyzing literary text, I do not take the location or historical references for granted or dismiss them as part of the Gothic paraphernalia. It is important that the inhabitants of the suspicious house in Taman speak Ukrainian, which Lermontov actually takes pains to transcribe, as we saw, right, into the original Russian. And it's important that this encounter takes place in the frontier Cossack settlement on the southern margin of the Russian Empire. All of this adds to the effect of ambiguity and frames Taman as a space fraught with danger. But Karamzin's narrator is stranded specifically on the island of Bornholm and not any other Scandinavian or Baltic island vaguely described in oceanic terms is significant, as I argue in chapter 1, as he learns about the Slavic past of the island, right, and draws connection to Russia's own history. I kind of see it as an alternative, darker history that Russia avoided. The fact that in chapter 5, let's skip to Pogorelsky Monastyrka, the convent graduate, the fact that her adventures unfold in the territory of the former Hetmanate in left bank Ukraine gives us insight into the novel's deep overriding anxieties about Ukrainian colonial mimicry and its evasive object, Russia's authentic culture, whatever it might be. And go to chapter 6, Mikhaila Chernyshensko's participation in the infamous Holstein campaign launched by Peter III, which Kulish describes in his novel, is not simply a plot device to get the hero out of the house, as some very good scholars have argued. The time setting, right on the eve of Catherine II's reign, invokes the last period of Ukraine's relative political and cultural autonomy, which Kulish nostalgically invokes throughout the novel. So deeply rooted in time and space, Gothic trope serves as vehicles of expressing and addressing profound imperial and national anxieties and traumas. So I've already referred to the southern setting of many traditional Gothic novels, and for the British Gothic, indeed, the North-South opposition is crucial as the South becomes a space into which the fears of the irrational, the dark Catholic past and medieval barbaric cruelty are displaced in an ironic reversal from the original Goths, the northern barbarians, right, psyching the sophisticated Roman civilization in the South. So I decided to kind of experimentally apply this North-South axis to the Russian case, but not just on a whim and not because it's done so in the British Gothic, but also because Russia did expand along this axis in the 18th century, right? And Petersburg, right, the imperial capital was built in the area that was essentially Finland, just as the Russian-Swedish war was still raging. They just conquered the territory and immediately moved the center, right, the capital to it. The war was still going on. And there is a strong sense of Russian northern identity in the late 18th and early 19th century. So this also allowed me to move away from the Saidian Orientalist paradigm, which is very useful, and I use it to some degree, but it kind of has dominated so much the studies, you know, of Russian Empire, Russian literature in the last couple of decades, that I felt that the cliche or the stereotype of Russia between East and West has completely obscured the importance of the North-South paradigm. With the notable exception of Otto Böhle's excellent book on North and Russian Romantic literature. So I use the North-South axis both as a trajectory of the imaginative geography of the Russian Gothic and as the organizing principle of my book, as you can see. I'm going to be done in a minute. Because of my interest in the uncanny aspect of the Russian Imperial Gothic, the interplay of the familiar and unfamiliar, I focus on the settings that are essential spaces of internal otherness, not completely exotic and alien regions like, say, the Caucasus at the time, but those that are part of Russia's own narrative of origins. So you have, for example, Ukraine that is associated with Kievan Rus, that is basically, right, absorbed into Russia's own narrative of origin as the cradle of Russian Orthodox Christianity. You have the North with the Varangian invitation, the Finns who maybe were Varangians, or maybe there is some connection. Catherine the Great explores the Finnish roots of Rurik, for example, and also, of course, the Chud tribes living in close proximity to the Slavs in the north. And Russia's general identification of the northern culture makes those ties stronger. Karamzin does it throughout his letters of the Russian travel, like we come from the north, we are the northerners, Danes, the English, me. So the spaces I examine are fraught with ambiguity that typically seeps through the Gothic tropes. To give a few examples, the Decembrist writers Livonia, now Estonia and partly Latvia, chapter 2, for them, it's an escape to the imaginary European Middle Ages, which Russia presumably didn't have, but it's also land of feudal savagery, a cautionary tale of the excesses of lawlessness and despotism, with clear parallels to Decembrist own political agenda. It's also a space with fluid borders, and for all its exoticism, it is often portrayed as historically Russian territory. Even more strikingly, Finland, discussed in chapter 3, is depicted in Russian literary and journalistic text as gloomy and sublime land of wizards that exist outside of history, simultaneously an old neighbor, relative, right through the Chud connection, and a recently acquired exotic territory, the docile imperial subject, and a dangerous and destructive irrational force, as Badovsky Salamander demonstrate. And the list can go on. I won't dwell too much on Ukraine because it's ambiguous status in the Russian Romantic and imperial imagination has been addressed by other scholars. But I just want to mention that all the writers, including in the southern Ukrainian section of my book, were intimately connected to Ukraine and acutely aware of its distinct history and culture. At the same time, they all took part in the Russian imperial project in various capacities, as was typical of Russia's cooperative colonizing practices. As a result, they produce poignant literary works that try to cope with this ambivalence, not in the least through employing Gothic tropes. They can again trigger the anxiety and the ambiguity. And I will end on a personal note, if I may, as a native of Ukraine myself. When I started this project, I envisioned it as a study of 19th century Russian literature and empire with no possible connection to the present and, God forbid, no immediate political relevance. I was very comfortable and cozy in my remote 19th century period. And of course, in 2014, this all changed as the Ukrainian Maidan revolution erupted, followed by Russia's annexation of Crimea and the following hybrid war in eastern Ukraine. And many of us, I'm sure, experienced the sense of a Gothic nightmare, but also painful recognition of the all too familiar imperial discourse of barbarism, chaos, primordial territories, kinship, historical ties, and so on. And as in a good Gothic novel, the past continues to haunt the present. I'll stop here, thank you. So back to Katya.
Yes.
And okay, I need to stop sharing, okay. It's good to share, no.
Sharing is great.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and I'm unmuted, perfect. So as Valeria mentioned, I have always loved to read Gothic novels. What's not to love? They involve exciting plots, unexpected twists, just the right amount of suspense, and so many over-the-top cliches that I can hardly stand it. There's the moment in Walpole's Castle of Otranto where a character is crushed by a giant mysterious helmet. There's the moment in Mysteries of Udolpho when the heroine peers behind the black veil, faints because of what she sees, and then the reader doesn't find out what the veil conceals for something like 400 pages. Who doesn't feel for Vathek, the eponymous hero of Beckford's novel, who grows so frustrated with his servants that he has them all beheaded, and then goes one further and kicks around their heads in a kind of macabre soccer game? And you have to love any book that comes with as many spoilers on the first page as this edition of The Monk. My book came out of this love of Gothic fiction. When I was in grad school, I was reading a lot of Gothic novels to avoid my comprehensive exam reading list. When I finally stopped procrastinating and got down to work, I started noticing little Gothic moments everywhere. At first, I thought I was mistaken because there were so many of them. But when I started reading the scholarship on these works, I found either that they glossed over or dismissed as simply a curious Gothic footnote, or no one seemed all that interested in what they were doing there. No one, that is, until I read Robin Miller's book on the Idiot, which was the first work that I know of in our field that takes the Gothic seriously and genuinely discusses the poetics of Gothic narrative. Most of the previous works that I had read on the Gothic sort of say, oh, it's an interesting, curious thing, or, oh, yes, of course, these authors were reading Gothic novels, but other than kind of being curiosity, it's not that important. My book traces the development of realism through analysis of the ways that Russian writers utilize narrative devices, tropes, and themes taken directly and explicitly from this European Gothic fiction. I argue that one origin of the Russian psychological realist novel can be found in late 18th and early 19th century Gothic writing. The first part of my book traces the migration of the Gothic aesthetic into 19th century Russian literature. I analyze the development of Gothic narrative devices from overtly Gothic episodes in late Romantic literature, like Tatiana's Dream in Eugene Onegin, or Chichikov's visit to Pushkin's estate in Dead Souls, to more subtle uses of the genre in early realist works, like Sketches from a Hunter's Album and Oblomov. This part culminates in a reading of The Idiot as a realist novel that incorporates a Gothic master plot. The second part of the book builds on my identification and analysis of the development of these devices to examine how they function in later 19th century works to articulate or contextualize specific social and political anxieties. These later case studies include chapters on urban poverty, the woman question, political terrorism, the decline of the Russian state, and finally, Gothic psychology at the turn of the 20th century. My book spans the long 19th century, from the first publication of a Gothic novel in Russian translation, which is Clare Reeve's The Old English Baron, published in 1792, to Bunin's use of a Gothic master plot in 1910. And I include analysis of texts by the usual suspects, so Pushkin, Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, but also works by Grigorovich, Dal, Nekrasov, Goncharov, Aksakov, Tur, Saltykov-Shchedrin, Savinkov, Bunin, and others. What's been striking as I've worked through the material for my book is just how prevalent these Gothic elements are across 19th century Russian literature. As an imported genre that was popular, but not quite highbrow, and which never really caught on with authors in Russia, to the fevered degree it did elsewhere in Europe, Gothic writing hasn't really been studied as an influential part of Russian literary history. The popular reading of Gothic novels, which were mainly imported or derivative, has been dismissed. But the influence of this popular reading undoubtedly persists. Why do Russian realist writers use Gothic narrative devices? This was kind of the question that underlies my study. I build on the work of Vatsuro and other scholars that I mentioned to examine the Gothic in the 19th century, but what's interesting here is that none of the literary works I analyze would be considered strictly Gothic, and Valeria mentioned this too. Rather, these are all examples of Gothic realism. That is, moments when authors writing in what we recognize as a realist style turn to Gothic narrative devices, using the genre as a tool to articulate a facet of lived experience through reader affect. In my talk today, I plan to give some examples of what Gothic narrative looks like when incorporated into a realist text, discuss these incidences, and then conclude with a discussion of what these Gothic realist moments accomplish. And I should say that the examples that I've picked today are perhaps not the most interesting examples, but they're the shortest. So they fit well into the talk. But you all should read the book for the more meaty, incestuous stuff. First, however, how do you identify a Gothic moment? A Gothic moment happens with a shift in narration, with the advent of Gothic narrative force. Gothic narrative force is the feeling of emotional momentum that is built using narrative devices common to the Gothic genre in a text. The reader encounters Gothic narrative force and is meant to be plunged into a self-conscious state of anticipation characterized by affective responses such as dread, anxiety, and fear. Peter K. Garrett, who's written a book called Gothic Reflections, which is about the way that he doesn't exactly call it this, but Gothic realism functions in the British context, describes Gothic narrative force in this way, quote, "The force of the desire to disturb and to be disturbed that joins tellers and their audiences and the counterforces that seek to control disturbance," unquote. Gothic narration is always specific and identifiable. The Gothic relies on the exaggeration of emotions, such as terror and dread, the anticipation of horrors, and moments of hesitation or uncertainty to create its fearful atmosphere. A Gothic novel's events take place outside of the everyday, and they're rendered more fearful because of the reader's dissociation from them. When we think of Gothic, our first association are its conventions, ruined abbeys, mysterious strangers, and black veil-shrouded secrets. And here is the poem that Valeria mentioned earlier. This is Rassomov's humorous poem, Plan for a Novel a la Radcliffe, published 1816. And in this poem, a list of these elements appears. You can see them all there. The emphasis in Somov's plan for a Gothic novel is on the senses. There's sight, the moon gleams. There's hearing, the wolves bay, the wind howls, and there's feeling. Beyond the mention of tormenting nightmares and mythological creatures, Somov names the primary effective operators in Gothic fiction, fear and horror. The poem's humor lies in its calling attention to the Gothic novel's formulaic quality, that the array of conventions is similar or the same in each text. While the repetition of tropes and themes to the point of cliché seems as though it would be boring, the positioning of tropes in different relationships creates new productive models, and the predictability of surprising and frightening elements assures readers' engagement. At least this is the way Horace Walpole theorized that the Gothic should function. Gothic writers connect with readers by provoking emotional responses. The Gothic novelist's main aim is to prey on readers' emotions through suspense, to make them feel this dread and horror, postponing resolution as long as possible to keep them turning pages. And this is one of the reasons why in The Mysteries of Udolpho, you don't find out what is behind the black veil for several hundred pages after it's introduced. The narrator, however, constantly mentions it, so it kind of builds up this suspense. The best Gothic novels were produced from, as Mark S. Simpson has observed, quote, "a particular frame of mind which questioned traditional values of good and evil, of virtue and reward, and which sought to test philosophical, religious, and ethical beliefs through the postulation of a basically uncertain and incomprehensible world," end quote. Arguably, the works also transmitted this worldview to their readers. And now to the examples from my book. The first example I'm going to discuss is from Sketches from a Hunter's Album. Turgenev's Bejin Meadow begins with a description emphasizing the beauty of natural elements. There's a meditation on the sun rising from behind a cloud, comparison of clouds in a blue sky to islands in a flooded river, and a lyrical description of sunset. The few Gothic moments in the cycle seem really at odds with the narrator's typical descriptive tone. These intervals demonstrate how writers use Gothic conventions to create a new realist aesthetic. As the story continues, night falls, and the narrator realizes that he is lost. The surrounding landscape description becomes more urgent and less lyrical. The narrator feels physically trapped by the place's topography, and his relationship to its individual natural elements also changes. As the narrator becomes increasingly uncomfortable in the setting, the night noises that seem so explicable and common in other stories, such as birds calling or bats crying, become mysterious. The entire landscape is transformed by the narrator's feelings. The transformation itself is not unexpected. The narrator's feelings and moods constantly, of course, shape the landscape in the sketches. Turgenev uses this description to influence his readers' feelings as well. As the narrator feels lost and frightened, so too narrative cues suggest that the reader should begin to feel anxious for the narrator. The terrified animals, sudden surrounding darkness, and looming sullen murk all promote this heightened anxiety. In this passage, the narrator looks to his hunting dog for comfort, but even this familiar creature serves only to discomfit him. The depicted landscape afterwards shows how the narrator's fears intensify. And you can see that specifically in the red highlighted text, right? The narrator's impression that the landscape participates in some mysterious dark meeting clearly derives from the fear that he feels. The passage aims to transfer the narrator's experienced fear to the reader. Gothic narrative force, linked so clearly with the buildup of Gothic tension in a work, aims here to create heightened anxiety for both the character and the reader so that they share this experience. This example clearly demonstrates the way that Gothic becomes a tool in a realist writer's toolkit. As Elizabeth Cherish Allen has observed, quote, Turgenev's narrator is not merely hunting for game or even simply hunting for new experiences, but hunting for a manner of narrating, that is, for a way to comprehend and communicate those experiences, quote. This statement could apply to any literary works from this period, really, when writers were by and large working out how to create verisimilitude in art, how to create realist narration through this array of devices. In the passage I've analyzed, we see one of the Gothic's narrative powers on display. It forges an affective bond between hero and reader, creating a more real reading experience, you could say. The next passage I'll examine is from the Physiology of Petersburg. Nekrasov's story Petersburg Corners. Here, the Gothic carries an additional function. It signals social critique. In this physiological sketch, Nekrasov plunges readers into the dark and seamy underworld of a Petersburg tenement, introducing a host of desperate characters. The lives of these people may be the main focus, but certain details describing place clearly establish a Gothic-inspired setting. As the narrator descends into the tenement, he compares the space with a tomb. Gothic exaggeration comes to the fore as he absurdly, in this passage, describes the marks on the walls as human bloodstains. Only after this first impression does the narrator reveal that the stains are in fact the remains of dead flies. The cobwebs decorating the room further add to the atmosphere. They suggest death and decay. Although the narrator pokes fun at these Gothic cliches, they serve to set the scene, emphasizing the more subtle anxiety built by the narrative as the piece continues. As the narrator progresses further into the tenement, each knock on the door is terrible, each new visitor is mysterious. The narrator represents the other inhabitants as cruel and the tenement as crypt-like. These descriptions sharply contrast with the brief mentions of the beautiful Petersburg daylight to create an overall sense of claustrophobic terror, as though these people have been driven to desperation by their unbearable surroundings. Here, Nekrasov uses detail in the same way it would be used in the Gothic novel, to amplify horror through setting. Nekrasov's example is one of many, and the other writers who worked together on the Physiology of Petersburg incorporated Gothic elements into their texts to establish atmosphere, engage the reader in the narrative, and communicate the urban force play. And I should say that Nekrasov, when I say that the other writers who worked together on the Physiology of Petersburg, what I mean is that if you read through the text, you can find nearly all of them using these kind of Gothic cliches in their writing to build up this kind of narrative suspense. Although Nekrasov does it a little more humorously than the others. The Gothic elements in these realist works clearly demonstrate the utility of genre and contribute to a kind of literary experiment in which the writer combines adopted generic elements to create a distinctly new form, realist representation. Beyond Turgenev and Nekrasov, many other writers engage with Gothic literature in their writing, essentially incorporating Gothic genre memory into the Russian literary tradition. While the original Gothic novel readers in Russia read mostly imported Gothic fiction, as Russian writers adapted Gothic narrative for its own purposes, Gothic readers eventually became simply readers, who were readily able to identify Gothic cues in Russian narratives, and perhaps even did this on a subconscious level. In Chekhov's 1892 story, Terror, two characters ruminate on the relationship between fear and the unknown. Dmitry Petrovich asks the narrator, why is it that when we want to tell some terrible, mysterious, and fantastic story, we draw our material not from life, but invariably from the world of ghosts and of the shadows beyond the grave? The narrator responds, quote, we're frightened of what we don't understand, quote. Dmitry Petrovich's juxtaposition of life or reality and the life beyond the grave, an unknown, terrifying, imagined existence, is no surprise here. The known and the unknown, life and death, are often opposed, certainly in literature. However, Dmitry Petrovich is also setting two styles of storytelling in opposition. The one, terrible, mysterious, and fantastic, and drawn from beyond the grave, maps to the Gothic genre, while the other, drawn from life, is at its heart a bare-bones definition of literary realism. As Dmitry Petrovich continues, he begins to conflate these two narrative modes. He says, our life and the life beyond the grave are equally incomprehensible and horrible. If anyone is afraid of ghosts, he ought to be afraid too of me. Goes on from there. He concludes, what I mean is, apparitions are terrible, but life is terrible too. I don't understand life, and I'm afraid of it. By the end of the passage, Dmitry Petrovich has merged the Gothic and literary realism, the fearfully imagined and the prosaically lived. And these last couple statements really get at the heart of what I call Gothic realism. As my book demonstrates, examining Gothic realism exposes the Gothic's potential as a literary mode that depicts the incomprehensible and inarticulable in a way that harmoniously coexists with verisimilitude. While the so-called Gothic wave of the early 19th century has been seen thus far as a curious footnote in Russian literary history, Gothic fiction, both imported to and written in Russia, has had a lasting influence that remains generative to the present. Often in Russian literature, the story has been that the Gothic cropped up as a derivative romantic movement, disappeared, and then mysteriously reappeared in symbolism. Such a reading neglects the vibrant Gothic fiction that existed from the Gothic wave Vadim Betsuro examined to the Russian and Ukrainian Gothic texts Valery Sobol has studied. As these studies and mine demonstrate, Gothic came to Russia in the late 18th century, fostered a vibrant literary tradition, and influenced generations of both romantic and realist writers. The age of the great realist novel passed, but the Gothic persisted, taken up anew by modernist writers, attracted to the genre's ability to transform itself and transfigure its hosting genre. And at this point, we're going to shift gears in our discussion and discuss how Gothic fits into Russian literary studies moving forward, and kind of talk about how both of our books fit into this. And I'll give you a suitable Gothic background image for this part. You can all fear, I don't know. Russian realism is irrevocably linked with the passionate philosophical and political debates that characterized literary cultural production in the 19th century. As the 19th century canon has been debated and formed in its various iterations, the sharp divide between highbrow and lowbrow cultural production that has emerged tends to privilege the weighty reputations of the century's major writers, so your Pushkin, your Tolstoy, your Dostoevsky, and neglect those who exist on its margins. However, Russian literary studies as a field would do well to remember that 19th century literature had both highbrow and lowbrow influences. Similarly, Gothic realism's prevalence in text by a variety of authors from across the political and social spectrum demonstrates a universality of technique and form within literary realism. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy are important, but we would do well to engage with voices that have not been as well amplified to get a true sense of both realism's versatility and what 19th century literature can tell us about 19th century Russia. As I've learned over the course of researching this book, Gothic realism is far too large a topic to be easily contained in one study. And that's just kind of a small part of 19th century Gothic. The case studies that I present in my chapters should be viewed as models for engaging with the theories that have been well developed within Gothic studies more broadly, rather than comprehensive examinations. And I should say also that for each example I include, one thing that's been really striking about this book is that I've had to admit at least half a dozen. So that it's a huge, huge topic. Gothic studies is a rich and versatile field, and in Russian literary studies, we've barely scraped the surface of what it has to offer. I hope that writing Fear helps make Gothic narrative force more identifiable when it appears in literary texts, puts to rest the myth that Gothic in Russia is a small and underdeveloped literary movement of no importance, and provides a framework for future explorations of Gothic in Russian literature. And at that point, I'll hand it over to Valeria.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief because we need to leave room for discussion. But basically, my takeaways from my research in a larger scheme of things, I would like to stress 3 points. So again, as Katya just mentioned, taking the Gothic tradition seriously, not just a passing Western vogue, can really enrich our understanding of the period. And it also makes Russian literature less provincial, looking at Anne Lounsbury here, because the presence of the Gothic in that literature is not just another example of Russia's belatedness to the Western literary development and its hasty adaptation of its genres and forms, because the writers examine, they do deploy these conventional Gothic tropes, indeed borrowed from the West, but they do it in the original and complex way, and specifically in the Russian imperial context as subjects of the Russian Empire. Secondly, as I already mentioned, it's critical not to take setting for granted. The cliche of uslovная, right, conventional, vague, symbolic token, geographic historical setting with the Gothic, as opposed to the historical novel, warrants serious reconsideration. And just as one example, Vadim Vatsura, whom we mentioned here, and who has my greatest respect and admiration for the work he did, without which neither of these books would be possible. Nonetheless, he has a chapter on Monastyrka, on Pogorelsky's novel that I examine in my book, where he wonderfully traces all the Gothic elements that it kind of mocks and parodies in Pogorelsky in his work. He never mentions the setting. I'm sorry, it's set in Ukraine. The heroine is an offspring of the Cossack lineage, and she was taken from her family, her little place in Ukraine, to St. Petersburg, to Smolny Institute, and returned home as a Russified and Westernized subject. And there's a whole scene, I mean, her whole family history illustrates the transition between the semi-autonomous Hetmanate and the incorporation of Ukraine into the Russian Empire. And who is Pogorelsky? He's the grandson of Razumovsky, the last hetman of Ukraine. I'm sure that wasn't uslovная a setting for him, right? It was deeply personal. So they neglect the lens, right? You just need to readjust the lens, and sometimes you see things you wouldn't see otherwise. And finally, I also found out that, and it's something, but not just me, Said found it out too, the persistence and coherence of a specific discourse and a specific literary tradition overrides and often penetrates the supposedly more objective and scientific, quote unquote, historical and ethnographic findings. And I'm kind of addressing historians here. When I gave my talk on Finland and at the University of Illinois, some historians were like, really, what can we trust now? You have the same person writing in his letters about the literacy of Finnish, low classes who read the Bible, who are Lutherans and know several languages. And you have the same person, Jakob Groth, talking about the wild, savage Finns, naive, childlike, living outside of civilization and culture among the cliffs. And of course, this discourse dominated the representations of Finland in literature and ethnography. So ethnography wasn't really like this objective scientific field we would want it to be. So in a sense, this discursive tradition creates its alternative reality, which is just as real, and I think warrants also as serious attention as supposedly documentary and factual one, and that can also, I think, enrich the larger historical research on the period as well. So I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Here's the flyer. Ta-da! Discount 30%.
Thank you both so much, Vera and Katya, for these really fascinating talks. And thank you for presenting your research together too. I think it's really enriching to hear about these projects at the same time. I know I have a lot of questions, so I'm sure other people do too. So why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions. You can put your question in the chat if you want. Sasha will be monitoring it. Or you can just write question in the chat, and Sasha will call on you. And certainly we welcome questions in Russian as well in English. If you prefer to speak Russian, that's wonderful. So feel free to join in at any time. Or I will take advantage of my position right now and ask one of my own questions, if that's okay. And this is addressed to both of you really, and it's about gender dynamics in what we learn about gender dynamics in the Russian tradition if we pay closer attention to Gothic elements. Does it change at all the way we think about gender either in some of the canonical texts that we always teach or in the tradition overall?
Katya, you have a chapter on the female Gothic, so I think in a good position to tackle this.
Yes, so when I first started working on my book, I thought that I would definitely have to have some kind of chapter on the female Gothic, on sort of Gothic sexualities. I thought this would probably be about ostensibly kind of male anxieties related to the new woman. And then I went to a conference that Margarita Weissman hosted at St. Andrews a couple of years ago, where there were a number of talks about women's writing in the 19th century. And what I realized was that I hadn't read a lot of these texts. And when I started reading these texts, I got really excited, and I threw out my admittedly terrible chapter about Gothic sexualities, and I became very inspired by the work of Yevgenia Tur. And what Yevgenia Tur does in her work that's really striking is she uses Gothic, what I call Gothic subjectivity. So she uses specifically Gothic text to put forward and to kind of build up spaces in her work where she is able to have kind of almost like a safe narrative space where she can explore alternative social structures, where she can explore alternative ideas that undermine the kind of patriarchal system that she works and lives in. What I do in my chapter is I look at the way that Yevgenia Tur enters into dialogue specifically through the Gothic with Turgenev. And what comes out of that is really interesting. So before I had read Tur's work, what I thought was that Turgenev was just kind of like using Gothic to have some corpses in his work, which maybe, because he has a couple of corpse descriptions in things like Diary of a Superfluous Man. And when he's describing these things, it's kind of like his dead mother's corpse, and he doesn't, I thought it was just effective, right? But once I started reading Tur's work, what I realized is that what Turgenev is doing is responding to Tur's work and actively kind of killing the female subject in his work. And Tur combats this in her work, and she does it through Gothic. So I think that Gothic narrative, like looking at Gothic narrative, has a lot to say about gender. And I've really just scratched the surface of it with this one case study that I found. But I also think that the fact that so many readers of Gothic novels are women really speaks also to the way that the feminine comes into and becomes associated with the Gothic genre, right? And I think that also looking at the Gothic genre, if you think about the way that most of the writers of Gothic are women, right? It demonstrates a lot more influence by women writers on Russian literature than maybe we previously had supposed. So it really, I think, opens up our field to looking at the feminine much more with, wider open eyes, for lack of a better word.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Shama Shahadat, if you'd like to ask your question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I have a question not about the Gothic mode, but more about the Gothic traces. And more specifically, my question is about the relationship between the sentimental and the Gothic, because in Radcliffe's novel, we have the sentimentalist part of the Gothic. We have the innocent maiden who is persecuted by the villain, which is very typical for the sentimental novel. And we have a very idyllic background, which is then disturbed. And for years, I have been wondering why Karamzin, in the beginning of his Biednaya Lisa, does not only present a bucolic landscape, locus amoenos, but why does he also include Gothic towers, which are near the river? And my question is, does Karamzin write the sentimental against the Gothic, or are the Gothic towers, are they kind of semantically empty quotation of the Gothic novel? And why does he introduce the Gothic towers into his Povest? And is the Gothic the negative background for Karamzin? And also, can we read Erast as a transformation of the Gothic villain? Because his eyes are not mentioned, but Lisa, in the first draft, she had dark eyes, and then Karamzin changed that, and then she got light eyes because she was to be innocent. So maybe, we don't know it, but maybe Erast has dark eyes, and maybe he is a kind of Gothic novel. So
thank you. Sorry. Can I try?
I'm finished.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, great question. So definitely, Radcliffe's manner is often referred to as sentimental Gothic, indeed, right? There's always this, fragile heroines and the beautiful natural landscapes, not just sublime and threatening, but also very pleasing as well. I wouldn't, so again, I look at it as a Gothic mode that kind of penetrates different, right, isms, as it were. So I wouldn't, like when I was at the university in Kiev, I all learned that the island of Bornholm and Sierra Morena are pre-romanticism, but poor Lisa is still sentimentalist, which of course it doesn't work that way, right? There is no clear kind of chronological boundaries. So I think Karamzin really entwines them in his fiction. But great question. I mean, I thought about the Gothic Tower in passing fleetingly, but I didn't really look at it closely in Biedna Eliza. But I'm suspicious. So whenever you see ruins, it's usually often has to do with memory, right? With the past that's haunting the present, the past, that the narrative of history and temporality is disrupted. The past is still kind of seeping through the present. And that's true of December's Livonian Tales. There's often the gaze of the traveler looking at the ruins. So I think that's not there just for negative background or for a tribute to the convention. I mean, I would have to kind of think more about the text, but I suspect there is that kind of sense of that past, the tragedy that occurred, right? That's still very much alive. And the history, right? The walls of the monastery have scenes of the battles of Russian past. So there's always this kind of connection again with the national history and imperial history, not just individual. So maybe the two are entwined here exactly in that way as in some other works I look at. So that's, if that helps. Mm-hmm.
All right, Katya, just so you know, your screen is still being shared. I'm not sure if you want to keep it up or not.
Shall we keep it up or shall we put it down? I was sharing it because it has Valeria's code on it. You should all buy her book.
That's totally fine with me. Just wanted to let you know in case you weren't aware. But we can keep it up. So let's take Eric Naiman. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks for the talks too. In most of the work on the Gothic, or a lot of the work on the Gothic, the question of authorial intention is obliquely relevant in that, for instance, a lot of the work on Anne Radcliffe implicitly assumes that she didn't really know what she was terrified of, that the anxieties there are hidden and repressed. And so the Gothic isn't being used as a device or a kind of almost, but as an expression of fears. And so I'm wondering in the work that both of you are doing, whether to what extent the anxieties that motivate the Gothic are being considered as unintended, right? And kind of more specifically in terms of, say, the female Gothic, which in the West has been very much bound up in some of the scholarship by men and women as being about uncertainty or fear of female sexuality or its female sexuality's manifestation in the society of the writer. Do, say, Russian women using the Gothic have different anxieties than women who write in the Gothic mode in the West?
So I can do this one, I think.
Yeah, I can add maybe a little bit, but go ahead, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so on the point of the last question about the women's Gothic, if you look at, for example, so a lot of, well, what I have looked at are Gothic writers who are writers who are working with Gothic fiction that are publishing in the middle of the century. So they're not writing nothing I work on is an explicitly Gothic text. And if you look at Yevgenia Tur, and by the way, everyone should be reading Yevgenia Tur, did I mention that too? She's fantastic, in the best sense of the word. But Yevgenia Tur is directly engaging with Charlotte Bronte. And a lot of the anxieties that Charlotte Bronte has in her works, kind of the idea of her own precarity in like how she will support herself, her place as a woman writer, her place as a writer in society that come out in her works, like for example, in The Professor or in Villette. and certainly in Jane Eyre, these also come out in Yevgenia Tour's works. Yevgenia Tour directly addresses these in her reviews of Bronte's works, where she says, you know, she kind of gets into a fight about the way that women writers are perceived in the 19th century, that they're seen as kind of second-class citizens precisely because they're supposed to have more emotion than men have, right, in their work, which makes their work less, according to certain male writers, Turgenev, makes their work less valid in some sense, right? And so the Gothic, I think, gives Yevgenia Tour certainly a space to explore these ideas and to write about these anxieties, but in a way that's not perhaps as overtly mentioning them, but that also connects with the British Gothic tradition, so that also connects with Bronte. Now, if you look at what female writers are doing in the early part of the Gothic, and as far as I have read, so I haven't read female writers that are writing in Russia that are writing Gothic novels from the early part of the 19th century or the later 18th century. And I admit that's my point of ignorance. But if you look at what Anne Radcliffe is writing, yes, she has these anxieties, and yes, she's writing things that that evince these anxieties, but that are also popular fiction. But if you look at the way that critics are examining what she's writing, you get the sense that she's writing in the same sense that like Mary Wollstonecraft was writing. And so Mary Wollstonecraft was also writing Gothic novels, and her Gothic novels directly relate to fears that she has related to the destabilization of the French Revolution, and also her experience as a, I don't know if you'd call her a feminist, a proto-feminist, her experience putting forward her feminist/proto-feminist views. I feel like that's a big jumble of stuff, but I think that this is, it's hard to say whether a writer has anxieties about things and how the writer is expressing those anxieties. But I think that what we can read from these works as we read them now is that anxieties exist in them, and what we want to read into them or how we read those anxieties can give us a sense of what writers are concerned about. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, to me it does. So just to jump in more general terms, since gender wasn't one of the lenses I used for this work, but I have a whole gallery of characters. As I said, the Monastirka focuses on the female character, who is this weak, right, kind of Emily, Ukrainian Emily, if you wish, who's like gets into her from the aunt's house, nice aunt's house, to the bad guardian's house, and like is taken from one castle / Ukrainian mansion to another. But in more general sense, I was kind of hoping that nobody would ask this question of intentionality, and also hope that somebody would, because it's something I have been kind of grappling myself with, because like, I'm not saying that, I don't know, Pogorelsky said, let me address the anxiety of my national identity through this Gothic narrative, right? It wasn't that degree of intentionality and awareness, I would think. I think the anxieties were real, and to what degree they're like fully processed or not, hard to say, but Pogorelsky he intentionally inserts his ancestors, Ukrainian ancestors, into the narrative, and he creates a double figure, both in his Dvainik and through his play of alter ego. He's actually Perovsky, who uses the nom de plume Pogorelsky, but inserts Perovsky into the narrative. So he's very conscious of kind of the Gothic potential of this uncertain identity play. But yeah, so I think the anxiety is very social, national, and so on are real, but to what extent the use of the Gothic in order to channel them, to what extent they're intentional, it's extremely hard to say. Probably not fully, but the Gothic is just out there and it works. I think consciously or not, we can psychoanalyze the writers, at least I can't, but they find those means of expressing these anxieties that prove powerful. So yeah, that would be my
if you look also speaking about intentionality, because my study stretches across the 19th century, in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, you get writers who are kind of self-consciously writing Gothic texts or putting Gothic into their narratives. And that this is really interesting to me, kind of the self-conscious use of the Gothic when the Gothic is not being popularly read, right? And I think that there's definitely a lot of intentionality there. Like, why would you do that in your narrative if nobody you know is reading these novels, but you are putting direct narrative devices or even plot elements from them into your text, right? So it creates almost a sense of nostalgia, but like a deliberate one, that is tied very specifically to the Gothic and with the writer's understanding of what Gothic is.
Yeah, and even early in the period I look at, you have a lot of kind of the meta literary statement mocking Gothic cliches, because as you saw in 1816, they were already seen as a cliche, and yet the same authors use them in a serious, way as well, just profusely. So the awareness of Gothic's sort of cliche nature does not stop them from still deploying the tropes because they work, I think. Mm-hmm. Does it make any sense?
All right. Tom Roberts, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I had a question that I think follows on Katya's statement about the self-conscious use of the Gothic, and that is Dostoevsky's relationship to it. And I recall that he read Radcliffe and presumably other Gothic authors. But I wonder if in addition to that, some Gothic themes and conventions were sort of mediated to him by writers like Scott or Dickens or Balzac or even Hugo. And those writers come to mind, or at least the first three, because Steiner refers to them as the urban Gothic, I think, in Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. My question is really whether that distinction matters, in terms of what shapes Dostoevsky's understanding of the Gothic, especially relative to the fact that he's engaging with it selectively and self-consciously, as Katya said, but also the specifically urban aspect, which seems not traditionally Gothic, right? So I'm just curious about that very specific component of it and how it comes to him by these French and English authors. And thanks to you both, they were wonderful presentations.
So go ahead, you're the Dostoevsky person here.
Yeah, right. So the way that I start my book is with a chapter called The Russian Reader's Gothic Library. And what I try and do in this chapter is figure out what Gothic would mean to a reader in the 1840s. So this is the time when Dostoevsky was reading all of these things that were kind of formative, and we know that Dostoevsky was getting his Gothic, as you said, from Balzac. He was getting it from Sue. He was getting it from Dickens. Certainly Oliver Twist has like some substantial Gothic passages, right? But he was also reading at the same time. He was a big fan of the Monk. He was reading Melmoth the Wanderer. He was reading everything Anne Radcliffe. So there were a lot of different influences. And what's interesting about the Russian literary market is that if you look at what was being published in Britain, you have different waves, right? So you have like the stuff that was written in the 1790s was published in the 1790s. And then people kind of got tired of it by the 1800s and new stuff was being published, to the point that kind of parodic things were coming out. But because the Russian book market operated in the way that it did, and because different things were being translated and put on the market at different times, you had a situation where in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, all kinds of things from the late 18th century, Shakespeare, and also the early 19th century were coming out at roughly the same time. So you might have a work by Schiller and also a play by Shakespeare, and the work by Schiller might influence the person who's acting in the play by Shakespeare to have a more Gothic kind of sensibility in the play, right, in his acting. And then at the same time, you might have Oliver Twist coming out onto the market. And I'm not saying that all of these things happened in the same year, but they did happen kind of at the time when Dostoevsky was doing a lot of reading and beginning to do his translations. And so you have a sense of the urban being part of this Gothic experience. And if you look at, I think we can't also discount Gogol's Petersburg Tales, which also come out and also inject kind of Gothic into the Petersburg setting, right? It's not exactly the same as, like Mysteries of Paris Gothic, but it's certainly urban Gothic-esque, Gothic fantastic that's set in Petersburg. And so I think that if you have to look at all of these influences, if you're looking at what Dostoevsky's doing. I will say that I started my dissertation thinking that I would have like one chapter on Dostoevsky, and I have a lot more than one chapter on Dostoevsky. He's kind of very excited to use these Gothic tropes in his texts. But what I find with Dostoevsky is that some of it is this kind of atmospheric building up that you find that's influenced from the French, from the British, from the texts of the 1830s. And some of it is taken part and parcel from this earlier Gothic. So one of the things that I examine is the way that the conclusion of The Idiot kind of basically follows or mimics the same plot down to the plot elements of the Black Veil scene in Anne Radcliffe. And what's interesting about that is that that is explicit, this earlier Gothic influence on Dostoevsky, right? So it becomes this Gothic mess of stuff that's being published, that's all coming out and influencing things together. But also there are specific influences that you can pick out of that. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Sorry. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I think I'm going to start just grouping questions. So we'll call on a few people at once and you can respond to 2 or 3 questions at once. So Ji-Young Hong, if you'd like to ask your question, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for your pretty beautiful talks. It was really useful since I'm working on the Russian Gothic for my dissertation project. Actually, I have a really short question since the picture in the last slide captures my eyes. A girl is sitting at the table with a candle and a mirror. And actually, I'm currently working on the role of candles and mirrors as deceiving vision and making fantasy in Russian Gothic literature. And I am actually analyzing Zhukovsky's Svetlana. And Svetlana's Gothic journey starts from actually exact the same setting, a table with a mirror and a candle. So it was really, I think it's really fascinating. And so maybe, do you have more information on this picture, or did you find anything noticeable related to light and darkness or artificial light in Russian Gothic so far?
So this picture, thanks for your question. And also I'm very excited that you're writing a dissertation on the Russian Gothic. I just want to say that. So this picture is not Russian. I should
yeah, right.
So this is taken from a frontispiece of a publication from 1833 of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. It's supposed to be in there, I think, Catherine Morland, but it's modeled on a kind of like parodic print that was made in the earlier part of the 19th century called the Gothic Novel Reader, where you have a kind of a person wearing an early like 1800 to 1810 style gown, sitting in front of a mirror with a candle, reading a book and looking really scared, but it's meant to be making fun of her. But this idea of the candle in the mirror as part of the reading process in the early 19th century, if you look at a lot of the early prints of Gothic novel readers that are coming out of Britain in the popular press, you'll notice this over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
If I might add, it just you know, spontaneously I thought of course, Gadania, right? Tatiana's Gadania also happens with
Yes.
the mirror and the candle. So there is this kind of supernatural, superstitious element even to that seemingly cultured, right, civilized activity of reading and the candle. I also, in connection to the ballads, I go back to my heavy pro-setting propaganda. Ludmila, of course, the bridegroom, right? The dead bridegroom comes from a particular war, always in a specific geographical location. And I think in Birger, he comes from the 7-Year War, but in Ludmila, he comes from the Livonian War. And in Olga, he comes from the Battle of Poltava. Mm-hmm. So we still have those axes, right, of Russian imperial imaginary as the genre, the horror genre is transplanted into the Russian content. It's also interesting, not related to the mirror and candle issue, but just in terms of the ballad genre would be, I think, productive to explore.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and I just want to apologize if there's some noise in the background. I'm currently in a packed house and I had some connection issues, so there's some shuffling around going on. Okay, so Ilya, I can read your message and then read your question, and then Anne, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, we can just group those two together if that works. So from Ilya, broad question, what is your sense of how the realist reception of Gothic in Russia was distinct in comparison with British and French? Thank you both very much. Looking forward to reading. And Anne, if you'd like to ask your question now as well. Anne Lansbury.
My question is actually fairly specific and directed to Valeria. I think Ilya's is kind of more productive. So let's do that. And if we have time, I'll ask my question.
Okay.
Okay, so so in Britain, British realist novelists have a sense of the way that British fiction, the English novel, has developed, and the Gothic is part of that, right? So you don't, yes, it's lowbrow, but yes, there's an understanding that everyone was reading it, and yes, it's the same thing as, say, looking at the way in Russian fiction that Romanticism kind of shaped realism, right? It's just part of the literary history. In France as well, you have a very well-developed Gothic movement in France. You have a lot of transfer between France and England. Like most of the novels that were published in Russia were translated from the French, because in France you had almost everything coming out of Britain was translated into French and published in France as well. And that obviously shaped the work of Balzac, shaped the work of Zola, shaped the work of Sue, like shaped the work of all of these people that are writing the realist novel. There are a lot of works about the way that realism was shaped by Gothic in the British context. So I know of 3 separate studies of Gothic in George Eliot. You have Elizabeth Gaskell, who herself is writing Gothic tales in addition to writing her realist novels. You have Dickens, of course, where Gothic, I mean, if you just look at Bleak House, right, Gothic is everywhere. Certainly in the thing that I'm forgetting the name of because I'm going senile, Wuthering Heights, no. Great Expectations, Great Expectations. So that's a very clear literary trajectory. If you look in Russia, if you look at Russian realism was shaped by all of these things as well as the Gothic coming before it, but the connections are a little less obvious. What I do find when I'm reading Gothic or when I'm reading realist fiction in Russia is that a lot of novelists mention the Gothic. So for example, in Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, you have a moment where Bazarov is talking about, I think, peasants on a road, and he makes a mention of Radcliffe. In Dostoevsky, you continuously have mentions of Radcliffe. In Tolstoy, you have the passage in War and Peace where you have like Andrei Bolkonsky is going back to his estate, and it's described like a Gothic castle, right? So you have these kind of mentions that are continuously coming up, and I don't exactly know what realist writers thought about the Gothic, but what I do know is that many of them were using the Gothic and not just in superficial ways. So those ones that I mentioned are fairly superficial, but many others engage relatively intensively with Gothic fiction in their works. And I think that that's not something that would happen if they were simply dismissive of it, or if they're dismissive of it, clearly got in their subconscious for them to engage at that level.
May I add a few things? Yeah. So it's not just about realism, but I think, well, for the early period, I think the Gothic reception overlapped with the historical novel, Walter Scottian novel. That's why we have this like intense historicity of the Gothic in the Russian context. And for later realism, it will be kind of guessing on my side, on my part, because Katya is the expert. But my suspicion is that Gothic other in Russian realism is more internal. You have, Bazarov says, here's the Radcliffe mystery to you, the Russian muzhik, right? It's not the mad woman in the attic from Jamaica, was she in Jane Eyre, but this Ukrainian blind boy, right? And Taman on the frontier, that kind of the figure of the Russian imperial Gothic, unlike British. So I think that could be another difference, but that's something we would need to explore in more detail. Of course, it's just kind of improvising.
And do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Actually, I think that you both started to kind of address the question that I had. Liara, in your table of contents, or maybe in your opening remarks, you talked about this kind of opposition between, you call Ukrainian colonial mimicry and versus authentic culture. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, it was in quotation marks. Sorry,
yeah, definitely in quotation marks. But I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit more. And the Gothic seems to occupy a strange relationship with the authentic, right? I mean, on one hand, it could be an expression of your sort of authentic interiority, darkness, occluded, hidden things. But on the other hand, it's so genre-y. It's almost immediately cliche as soon as it gets invented. So I'm kind of trying to think about the relationship between those two things.
That particular, the framework of colonial mimicry that I applied to, again, to Monastirka. Gosh, I only talk about Monastirka today, but there are other chapters. And that chapter actually, as you saw, I think overlaps with your study of provinces as this kind of imitation of an imitation, right? So we see those Ukrainian characters in the novel who desperately mimic some imaginary Western culture, or St. Petersburg culture, which of course is French, and then as a result, it results in some really comical, but also terrifying. So it seems like comical and travesty and satire, but behind this, you see this terrifying void. And one character, Prishkov, who drops, Prishko, the Ukrainian Prishko, who adds the V to his last name to sound more Russian and speaks bad French and cannot get this perfectly refined heroine who's a product of the Smolny institution I'm bringing. He ends up moving to St. Petersburg and then to Paris and hangs himself there, according to the rumors. So there is this relay of colonial mimicry when Ukrainians are chasing the Russians, Russians are chasing the French. It's similar to what you do with provinces, but it plays out in that specific, and it's always exactly like Homi Bhabha says, almost the same, but not quite, right? Ukrainians are trying to be like the Russians, but this, like the narrator says mockingly, her accent still smacks of good old Ukraine. They cannot quite do it. And those who do become, like Anyuta becomes this Gothic heroine whose movements, like Gothic movements from one house to another, from one family to another, actually reflect her cultural rootlessness as well. So there is this deeper connection again between the Gothic plot and the underlying anxieties. As for authenticity, so in this case, there's really nothing.
It's very hot and humid.
Oh, sorry. As for authenticity, that's the kind of source of the Gothic horror that there is none, right? And it's terrifying in most cases. Or when it's existed, like in Kulish's novel, it's gone and it's only the ghost of the past that he's trying to chase through this antiquarian work, through his heroes placing them back and pursuing some Cossack glory ideal that's past. So this also adds another layer of Gothic, Gothicity, engagement with the heroic past that's gone. That's kind of ghostly. And in terms of the genre, I think that's the main problem, that I think that the anxieties, the issues are real, the forms maybe not authentic, but the way they're employed, because they address and contextualize in a particular way, makes it more valid. And that's why I think we should look at the Gothic and not dismiss it again as a cliche, as inauthentic, as a boring. That's what we've been trying to say. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that helps enormously. And both these talks have been really enlightening. And I know that these books are going to be very useful for me in my own thinking. We're actually supposed to wrap up this time, so I'm sorry. I hope we're not leaving any questions open in the chat, but it's been really great, and I know that we're going to keep thinking about this work as we move forward, and we look forward to seeing you at the next installation of the series, which will be Maria Tarutina joining us from Singapore. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks.